Thank you. I am honored to be here. I had no knowledge of the Washington Trails organization prior to Randy calling repeatedly, and then Joey following that up, and my arm still hurts. Before I go too much farther, I want to recognize two men who are sitting here, actually only one of them now, Rick and Mark Ziegler. Their father, Dick Ziegler, was an avocational archaeologist in Venango County in the 1950s through the 1980s. His collection, or part of his collection, is in the courthouse in Venango County on the first floor, the main floor. He hooked me and reeled me in. I was a teacher and I was interested in archaeology, and I have to tell you that it became an all-consuming passion. My wife would agree. I'd also like to thank Dr. Stanley Lance, who worked with the Carnegie Museum for 35 years. And I'd like to thank Dr. Barry Kent, who worked with the Pennsylvania Museum and Historical Commission. Both of them came to the excavation that we did at Fort Machault. They spent a lot of time both with me and the crew on the excavation and on the classification and identification of artifacts. So there's one more thing that I want to do. I've noticed as I was sitting over here that there was some. So I would like you to turn to your. Am I on? Is that,
No, just that.
no? I would like you to turn to your neighbor, and in your very best French say, "Monsieur, parlez-vous français?" Good. All right, then there's one more thing that I want to say before I dive into this. I have 3 grandchildren. If we go to a restaurant and they have 3 boxes of crayons and 3 pieces of paper to color a picture in, we will get 3 different interpretations of what that picture should look like. What I'm going to say today will be a little bit different maybe than what you've heard. I may be coloring with a little different crayon. So the picture that you see up here, is this thing not going to reach that far? Apparently not. Okay.
I think it will.
I don't know what. Anyhow, this is Fort Machault as drawn by Charles Stotz in a book that he wrote called The War for Empire. It's a coffee table type book. He was funded by the Kaufmans, and it's a marvelous book. Which one do I use there?
It's, this is forward.
No, I know that. What's the pointer?
Oh, the pointer is.
Pointer's in the middle.
There, in the middle. There we go.
Okay, wonderful. This is a representation of what he understood the fort to look like, this being the Allegheny River, French Creek flowing in over here. This would be Fort Machault. There's an idealized sketch of villages, of a village here and an Indian camp here. Idealized. Okay, these are approximate locations of Native American nations prior to the European arrival. It begins with Atlantic fishing, the fishing industry in the 1500s into the 1600s, which leads to trade goods being exchanged for furs, which were used in Europe partly to make hats. The land claims which follow, both coastal land claims and interior settlements. There are labor needs. and there are finally ownership disputes. Now, I used the title Thresholds Crossed because it's not just two nations. There is a war that goes on between the 1620s and the 1670s, initiated primarily by the Iroquois. The Iroquois are the red arrows up here, and they originate out of the Five Nations up along the lakes. They absolutely destroyed the Erie Nation, which is down here along Lake Erie, but they traveled in their warfare to control the fur trade out into the Lake Superior region, out into the Lake Michigan region, and there are some reports that suggest they made it to the Mississippi River. It was a brutal conflict. So how could one nation of people take over that many other nations? Well, guess who had the guns? And guess who didn't have the guns? And that is one of the reasons why the Iroquois were so successful. Now, when the Iroquois do this, they claim all of that land by right of ownership. We conquered all these people. This land is ours. So when it comes time to make treaties down the road, they're willing to give that land up in order to keep some of the land that they have because, hey, they owned it, right? They conquered all these people. Well, there's a treaty that happens in 1701 called the Great Treaty of Montreal, and 1,300 Native Americans from 39 different Indian nations come to Montreal, and over the period of that summer, they form a treaty to establish a common hunting ground along Lake Erie, north of Lake Erie, Huron, Michigan, all the way out into the Midwest. That is land that is supposed to be available to any group that wants to hunt in those areas. It's to be called, in the writings, it was called the common spoon. There are a number of different groups that are in this area, 39 different nations. The British, through the English governor, worked very hard to block this treaty from happening. Now, these are some of the groups, and these are their signs, the groups of Native American nations that came to this treaty, the Treaty of Nanfan in 1701. And you'll see, here's the governor of France. Here are the Onondagas. Here are the Senecas. Here are the Oneidas. Here are the Cayugas. Here are the Wyandots, the Mississaugas. The Sauk, the Menominee, the Ho-Chunk, the Miami, which controlled a great deal of what is now western Ohio and Indiana, the Wee, the Cree. All of these nations came to represent their nation, their communities at this treaty. Some of them traveled 1,000 or more miles to get to Montreal to sign a treaty which said, hey, we're not going to do any more fighting. We are going to respect each other's nation, and we are going to work together with this fur trade and these trade goods. So about 1750, this is the English land along the east coast. There were about 1.5 million British subjects living along that coastline. The rest of this, that's all blue, France claimed, because LaSalle had traveled through a lot of that country in the 1680s, 1670s, and France claimed that land. In 1750, there are forts or trading areas, they're called forts, but they're actually trading posts, clear out on the Mississippi River, all the way down here to New Orleans, Quebec, and Montreal. Now there's a couple crucial things to recognize here. One of those crucial things is 1.5 million people in here in what becomes the colonies. About between 50 and 75,000 people in all of this land here that are French subjects. A lot of them are 1 or 2 people that are living in villages. They are traders. These nations that are out here, these Native American nations, are sending their furs back, and they have a choice. They can send them to Albany and New York, or they can send them to Niagara, or they could send them down to the Mississippi. It's kind of a mistake to think that it's just beaver, deer, elk, buffalo, bear, marten, fox. All of those were valuable furs, but the most valuable fur for the market was beaver. It's because beaver have 2 kinds of hair. They have guard hairs on the surface, and they have a finer fur underneath. And that finer fur is a lot like the fine lamb's wool that some of you may recognize through spinning. That fine fur can be compressed if it's not combed out, and it can be turned into a hat. That's what they were used for, broad-brimmed hats.
Oh. The population of the French and the English at that time, I might have missed it.
Yeah, they did. The French at that time had about somewhere between 75 and 150,000 people in all of this blue territory. The English could claim nearly 1.5 million people along the coastline. It's a lot of people. One more thing that I wanted to comment on there. In order for the English to get supplies to these colonies on the East Coast, they simply brought their boats or their ships across the ocean, and they docked in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, or Charleston. Pretty easy. For the French to get supplies, they had to come across the ocean, go in the St. Lawrence Seaway to Quebec, take everything off, put it on rafts, take it to Montreal, and we'll continue on that in just a moment. So these are the English, the royal charters for the colonies. Pennsylvania is here. It has a block. That's part of what is given to the Penn family. Virginia has a charter that says it goes from the Atlantic Ocean to the Great Water to the west, the Pacific Ocean. South Carolina and the Carolinas, well, North Carolina is pretty small. South Carolina has the same sort of a charter, all the way. New York, which is up here, has a charter that includes a lot of what is now Canada. That's all royal charter. It's given to them by the King of England through the Board of Trade. So we have a little group of people called the Ohio Company who come into being as they recognize the value in the 1740s, the value of all this land that Virginia might own. And they form a company. It's actually a land and investment speculation company. It has not much to do with the understanding of trade. It's about selling land and settlement. And these are some of the officers: Governor Dinwiddie, Thomas Lee, Augustine and Lawrence Washington, John Mercer, George Mason, Richard Lee, Ludwell, Thomas Lee, Philip Ludwell Lee, Thomas Cresap, and George Mercer. All of these men are all wealthy landholders in Virginia. This man, Lord Halifax, is the president of the Board of Trade in England. He sells the idea of this. What does this mean? Well, what it means is 500,000 acres of land has been granted to the Ohio Company. All they have to do is get 100 settlers out there and build some forts. And they don't have to pay anything for 10 years. You don't have to pay anything. And after that, who owns the land? Well, you don't. It's actually the Crown's land, but you can pay a quit rent on it, which means every year you have to pay something. Well, it didn't sound too bad if you're one of these gentlemen right here, because you're the ones that collect the quit rents. So this is from George's notebook, I don't even know what rank he was, Washington's notebook, and there are better examples of this scattered back here on the tables, but this is the forks of the Ohio. Chenopinstown, which we've mentioned, is here. Queen Aliquippa, who was a Native American, is here. And Wills Creek is in here. And these are the words that George writes as he reflects on his trip up at 21 years of age. Now, his brothers are members of this Ohio Company. Their interest is in telling the French, you must leave. This is our land. And the French have already buried lead plates there in 1749 with Celeron. They already have been there in 1739 with an expedition that went clear out to the Mississippi River. They had explorers that explored all the way across the Midwest, LaSalle and others. If anyone had a right to claim the land, it was the French. If anyone is able to claim the land, it's the English. And if anyone is going to lose that land, it's the Native American nations, 39 of them at least. So, this is a map called the Line of Forts. This one on the right is part of a book that Paul Wallace wrote. There's a couple of examples for sale back here. It's called The Indian Paths of Pennsylvania. This is where Fort Machault, Fort Venango, Fort Franklin, and the old garrison were built. The important part of this map is to notice how many Native American trails exit either out of or enter into this one small area. The other thing that's important to understand is these red dots are Native American communities. They are occupied by different nations in some cases. They are occupied by mixed nations. The yellow stars are the 4 French forts: Presque Isle, Waterford, Machault, and Fort Duquesne. This whole line of forts over here was constructed by the British in order to prevent Native American raids. Well, who's going to come and raid them? Well, in the process of the British making allies of the Iroquois and the other nations that lived here in the beautiful river in the Ohio Valley, which included the Allegheny River at that time, there were expectations of gifts being given. What kind of gifts would you give? Well, you would give blankets or strouds. You would give clothing. You would give pots, brass pots and iron pots. You would give beads. You would give guns. You would give lead. You would give powder. You would give rum, brandy, other alcohol. You would give those once a year at a location that was central. So one of those locations was in Logstown. There's a model of Logstown over here. Logstown is located about here, and it's where Washington begins his journey north up and through the beautiful river to meet with the French, to meet with everybody that he was commissioned to say, you got to leave. You can't stay here anymore. This is the Ohio country, Virginia property. So I've got 3 or 4 slides here, and I'm going to ask you to read those, and I will just touch on a couple of them. Here, go back. Here's distance. France to Quebec, to Montreal, to Lake Ontario, 7 miles around the Niagara Escarpment, Lake Erie, Fort Presque Isle, then across to Fort LeBoeuf, then to Fort Machault, then down to Fort Duquesne. It's a 600-mile trek from Montreal to Fort Duquesne. That's one way. You got to walk that, you got to travel it on boats, you got to do portages around the rapids. It's a difficult trip. Then you got to take all the stuff that you get back, Native American furs and anything else, all that has to go back. So your trade goods go in and your traded furs come out. The travel is a problem. There are disruptions, particularly between France and Great Britain, because, and we don't think about this, but at this period in time, Great Britain controlled the ocean. They had more ships. They had the islands down in the Caribbean to use for ports. They had all those cities along the East Coast to refit. France sent a fleet once a year across the ocean with their warships in order to get to New England, or to Quebec, where everything had to be unloaded and then reloaded, and then you know the pattern. These are problems we do not discuss at all, but those are the problems that occurred for the troops who were out in the French, probably in the British forts, but definitely in the French forts. Many of the guys who were out there were impressed. The French, they came to New France as habitats. They came as wards of somebody in France who paid their way to come over to occupy land. They owed their allegiance back to that individual, that seigneur. There were accidental deaths. There was exhaustion, starvation, desertion, and if you were caught deserting, execution. Sanitation was a problem. Hygiene is a problem. There's lice and there's ticks. The weather, particularly in 1755 and 56, was severe, incredibly bitter winter. There is water, there's limited travel on the water. There's clothing problems. There is a 50% spoilage on the food which comes across from France, the salt pork and the hardtack. There are not many gardens. There is a drought across Ontario and flour isn't being raised. The land is overhunted. There isn't food. And after this war ends, most of the commanders who were here in this New France are taken back to France and tried, because There were leadership problems, graft problems, corruption. All of those things were a problem. So here we're going to talk, how am I doing on time? I don't. 30 minutes? I'll take that. All right. 1732. The dispossessed Shawnee, as has been mentioned, and the Delaware begin to relocate along the Peaceful River south of the city of Franklin, probably from any place that was a flat area south of Franklin, certainly down as far as Kennerdell. I forget who I talked to that was from Kennerdell. Certainly as far down as Kennerdell, the Shawnee Nation settled there. There was a Frenchman named Joncaire the Elder who is commissioned by the French governor, but he's also an adopted Seneca. He is commissioned to come down and convince the Shawnee to leave this area and move over into Ohio because of the influence of the British, and he's somewhat successful at that. John Fraser, an English blacksmith, builds a cabin at the center of, at the corner of French Creek and the Allegheny River. And with that, we have this image of this individual going out into the countryside and building a trading post. And that's really not as accurate as it could be, because these traders have a connection across all, the British at least, have a connection all across this western frontier. The supplies for these traders in the Ohio country come through Philadelphia, and they're brought over the mountains, and they're distributed out to Logstown and out to Pickawilly and up to John Fraser and up to Lake Erie, up at Sandusky, and down into West Virginia. Now these guys, the French, Celeron and Bienville, brought 200 troops down in 1749 and buried those lead plates. I'm not confident any of them have been found. That people say they have. I don't know that. In the spring of 1753, 2,200 men leave Montreal with the intention of building 4 forts and trading posts on the beautiful river. They build one at Presque Isle, they build one at Waterford, and that's about as far as they get with their building, because winter sets in and most of those men go back, because it's easier to feed the men in Montreal than it is 400 miles away from where the food is. In 1753, Washington, Gist, and guides find Captain Joncaire, who is the son of Joncaire the Elder. Captain Joncaire is also an adopted Seneca. His father brought him down along with his brother, and he spent years on the Seneca lands, learning the language, traveling over to the Oneidas and the Onondagas, traveling and learning. He knew the Delaware language. This man actually built a trading post. Where is he? Joncaire, Captain Joncaire, built a 2-story trading post at Logstown, and he was forced out of there by the British. So 1754, well, 1753, when they come, they're informed that they have to go further north up to Fort LeBoeuf, and Fort LeBoeuf will be following me. Officers' quarters and a 2-story barracks building are built in 1754. In 1756, Joncaire is replaced. He's ill. He's replaced by Chevagnier. They build the corner bastions and the palisades. Le Mercier, a Royal French engineer who actually constructed a lot of Fort Michilimackinac, is brought in, and he constructs a munitions magazine in the southwest bastion. 1756, They build also as many as 40 small cabins. Some people suggest that these are log on log. Others suggest that they are poles placed into the ground with bark covering the cabins. The only thing that I really have read in several places is that if you slept in one by yourself, you might not come out with your hair. Not a good thing, I guess. They also constructed a sawmill north of that village. Fort Duquesne was attacked and abandoned by the English under General Forbes. We heard about that. And the commander at Fort Duquesne, de Lignery, sends most of the people, including women and children, downriver to the Illinois country where there are more French forts. And he takes 100 men and goes upriver to Fort Machault, where he has shooting platforms constructed inside the fort along those palisades. He has borrow pits dug and redoubts constructed around the outside out of earth. In 1759, this is a long one, 1759, they received orders to retake what is now Fort Pitt. Now, we've heard that there were only a couple hundred men there. There were close to 2,000 French troops, habitants who were forced into labor, and Native Americans who assembled at Fort Machault. Had they gone downriver, what you said to your neighbors when we started might be the language of our land, because they would have taken Fort Pitt. They would have continued to have presence, but that isn't the way it worked out. On the day that they were to leave, a courier arrived from Fort Niagara saying Sir William Johnson and 3,500 British and Native Americans had attacked and placed Fort Niagara under siege. Now, Fort Niagara really is the point of no return. You have to, if you're French, you have to come, excuse me, I'm in my not teacher mode. You have to come in from Quebec, you have to go through Montreal, you have to Quebec through Lake Ontario, Lake Erie, down. You have to go past Niagara to get to that lower French country. They're holding a siege. The commands are changed. They are told to go immediately up the road to Lake Erie and to get to Fort Niagara any way possible. When they arrive there, the French are assembled in marching columns. The British and the Native Americans have concealed themselves in the woods along the valley, and when the French march in to take the fort, 75% of them are killed, wounded, or captured. And it ends the French domination and the French opportunity for dominion in this new world. As news of that, and Sir William Johnson sent news by runners to everybody that he could, the palisade and the bastions and the barracks were pulled down and burned by a small group of men who stayed there when everybody else went north. The maps that we have of Fort Machault are drawn not by him, but as a result of his sketches one day as he returned from Fort Niagara after the battle at Fort Niagara. There's a picture of that over here, and the fort that's over here is a representation of that. So this is the map that's in the book. It's in the Frontier Forts of Pennsylvania. It's available online or in a good bookstore as a reprint. And this is an example that Charles Stotz drew prior to the one that was in our initial picture. You'll see the fort. You'll see the Allegheny River flowing past, French Creek coming in. There's a road that is marked to Fort LaBeouf, and there's a road here that's marked to Fort Duquesne. There's a small village, there's a sawmill. Any of you been in Franklin? If you drove down 15th Street Hill into Franklin on Route 8, you would have seen this stream, except it doesn't flow through Franklin anymore. At this time, it flowed along the base of the hill, it flowed through Franklin, and it came out just about where 8th Street is, where the bridge is that crosses over the Allegheny River if you're on 322 headed toward Clarion. This is a little better picture of the fort itself, and listed over here are the locations that are identified on the fort. This is the front gate. The Allegheny River is here. There were barracks along the river. There were barracks. That small group of village houses is off to your right. These are the bastions. This is the officers' quarters. And these palisades and the shooting platforms were constructed later. There were, depending on the reports, between 15 and 50 men stationed at the fort. They suffered from all of those problems that we introduced earlier. Whoop. Okay, if we didn't have all these houses, the fort would sit right about there. This is Elk Street, this is 6th Street, and there's a marker that was placed here by the Daughters of the American Revolution many years ago. We conducted in 2007 Venango Archaeology, which is not privately held, it's a public organization as affiliated with the Society of Pennsylvania Archaeology. Brian Fritz, who is in the blue here, is a geologist. He came up and we put in auger holes, 3.5-inch auger holes every 5 meters across both sides of the street and in backyards. We found evidence at this site where there might have been the fort. So we got permission from the landowner, and we opened up this a series of 4 squares 1 meter wide. 1 meter by 1 meter, 4 of them. This is Stanley Lance. We dug those 4 meters out, and we encountered all this stone, and initially we said, wait a minute, this has got to be a road here, right? And this is where Barry Kent stepped in and said, if it were me, I would see what's under those stones. Because we were pretty much ready to say that's it. So we did go under the stones, and what you see here is what the archaeologists would call the A horizon. It's that dark soil. You would see a lighter colored soil, and you would see another darker colored soil. That's a second A horizon, and it's right on top of those stones. All of this light colored soil is overburden. When you build a house, what do you do with the dirt from the basement? You spread it around. And that's what all of this is. This is dirt that was on top of all of these stones which are right underneath the A. We went down about 5 feet below these stones into what was the root cellar for Fort Machault. Now, people have asked, how did you find all these beads? It's a public operation. And this is our water screen. A couple of our crew are younger. Some of our crew are not so young. It was open to the public. Anybody that wanted to come, we would show them how to do the work and invite them to stay, whether it was for an hour or the whole time. These are some of the things that we found. These are flintlocks, flints, and these are all French. We found one English flint. It's made in a different way. These are all flaked off and then chipped on the back. This is flaked almost like it's sawn. It looks much more like you'd find on a gun today, on a flintlock. We used the kid and kid classification. We recovered 3,650 beads that we could identify by type. Some of those are back here in the showcase. There were also a lot of beads that were melted when the fort was burned by the French. Remember, they pulled down the walls and they burned everything. In 2012, we went back with a magnetic resonance system that Brian Fritz put together, and we identified this. He wrote an article for the Pennsylvania Archaeologist. He believes that was a blacksmith shop, not a foundry, but it would be where the fire was. These are post molds that extended out away from it. These are some of the iron artifacts that we recovered. This is a caltrop that's up here. Caltrops were thrown by both the British and the French on trails in the intent of crippling horses when they carried packs in or out, because the caltrop is pointed and it would go through the horse's hoof right through the frog. These are either knives. This probably was a knife because there's a brass clasp on it. Fish hook. These are rose-headed nails that are significant because they are made before nails were manufactured. There's a process specifically to make those. These are some other artifacts. Besides that initial operation, we went back 5 more times over 5 summers. We found corn husks or corn cobs in a smudge pit. This is part of the crew. This is part of the southern barracks wall, which they placed logs on. These are some of the artifacts: a mouth harp, pipe beads, some glass from case bottles. And this is where the fort would have been. This is Elk Street, 8th Street, which would go across the river, and that's still there today, 8th Street. Now, Fort Venango would have been right here. That's the fort that's built in 1760. This is 7th Street. There's a large school right in here. This is 6th Street. And all of these are those little houses that weren't safe to sleep in, apparently. This is Fort Machault. These 2 yellow blocks represent the 2 areas that we've excavated. There are houses built all along here behind these blocks, except for this one. This was the empty lot that has never been developed, and there is probably more of that bastion in that empty lot. It's 18 feet wide, 18 feet wide and 150 feet deep, but it's probably there. There is no recorded location of where George Washington visited with Captain Joncaire. We have no idea whether one of these other buildings inside this are that fort or not. And I see my soccer red card is up. I'm being thrown out. If you have questions, I will be over here, and I'll stick around after the evening or after the afternoon. I hope we're still here well, some of you hope we're not still here this evening. Thank you very much.